Hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay due to some technical problems with modern technology, but now we can begin. Before the projector, no, the third part, yeah, okay, that's will take care of in a moment. The projector is on just on mute. That's on, but you need to move to the PowerPoint. No, no. Here it's on mute. You can mute, but first move to the that you can see the. You don't see the presentation here. Where is the presentation? It is not open. Yes, it's not open for some reasons. Oh.
No, we want to get rid of that.
Be bigger. Okay.
The side.
On the.
Okay.
Okay, so sorry. Before I'll introduce our guest for tonight, came from afar. I just would congratulate Leo Corey there for his new book. Together with that's one with Ayala Vitan. Ayala Vitan just appeared online this week on. It's the second book on the Weizsäcker. It's on Chaim Perkis and the Art of Applying Mathematics with Weizsäcker 1955-1963. So this is the book, and we heard some things. I think it was here that we had a talk connected to that on that's the book. Yeah, about the book, and that's so this is the first part. Now you can clap and. So our speaker today is Catherine Wilson. Came to us from Berlin, where she's now staying, but she's had actually a very international career in the United States and England, where she is the anniversary professor of philosophy at the University of York. And she's also a distinguished professor at the Graduate Center of CUNY in New York. Used to be. Oh, okay. Sorry. So more recently, in New York is emerita, no? That's connected. And she has published numerous articles in the history and philosophy of the life science, ethics, and aesthetics on Descartes, Leibniz, Locke, and Kant. And quite a few books. I will mention only 3 of them. One is on early microscopy and the invisible world from 1995. It was published in Princeton. And another was the history of atomism and Epicurean philosophy and the origin of modernity, published in 2008 at Oxford University Press. And another one at Oxford University Press from last year is on Kant and the naturalistic turn to the of the 18th century. So the talk today, as you saw, is beyond metaphysics, the bio-social perspectives on agency, on responsibility. And I'm very happy that we have you here as a guest, Catherine, and looking forward to hear your talk.
Thanks very much. More technicalities. Do I have some amplification? Do I need?
Yeah, you can use this one for word. Do you want to stand or to stay?
To stand. Okay. Well, first let me thank you for the invitation to come to Israel for the first time and to be part of this very distinguished colloquium series. It's also, I'm happy that it's given me a chance to talk about 3 things, really: history of philosophy a little bit, and philosophy of natural science and philosophy of social science. So that's kind of unique opportunity. I should confess that when I started writing up this, not when I started writing up this paper, when I was kind of halfway through, after having been thinking about this problem off and on, I have to say, since I was an undergraduate, problems of determinism and free will and responsibility, I thought I would ask ChatGPT, what is the best argument for free will? And ChatGPT said the best argument for free will is that people think they have free will. I thought, well, at least I haven't missed the latest breakthrough. It would force me to revise my whole paper. But then I thought, well, maybe what I have to say is really just a sort of complicated way of saying the same thing. So that's a possibility. We'll have to see. Okay, so just by way of introduction, I'm sure familiar with this problem. Moral and legal responsibility seem to require free will. Philosophy tends to affirm it, especially Kant, but never really explained it very well. And science has tended to skepticism, citing either Laplacian determinism, which I'll say a word about, or some version of machine man. And my attempted contribution is to get past this essentially 18th century dialectic, and instead to give you a two-level account, a biological behavioral account of animal agency across the taxa, and then layered on top of it an anthropological or sociological account of specifically human knowledge and practice. So first I talk about continuities, human and animal, and then about differences. So first thing I discovered when starting to work up this paper was that determinism, people were really very enthusiastic about determinism in the 18th century. And this had to do, I suppose, with trying to bring all of the cosmos under the laws of nature. Descartes as an example, Spinoza as an example, Leibniz with his psychophysical parallelism, Laplace, La Mettrie, who extended the Cartesian animal machine into a human machine. And typically the people who were most enthusiastic about determinism, like Spinoza, La Mettrie, and an opponent of Kant's, Schultz's, were also very worried about punishment and legal and moral responsibility, saw a conflict here. So La Mettrie said that judges should be physicians. He said the criminal can't help what they're doing any more than the Nile can change its course. And the opponent of Kant, Schultz, said we should treat offenders with love and try to get them to behave better in the future because they can't help what they do. The major exception to this trend of determinism was Kant, whose transcendental idealism, I think, was really constructed as a barrier against determinism. He was very worried about morality, and by making space, time, causality, matter, all those things that would depend on us, he thought he was blocking that kind of move. And he had a kind of backup theory that morality is objective, morality depends on free will, so belief in free will is compulsory, which seems to be a very different kind of argument. But the problem didn't go away. Even in the 19th century, Ernst Mach took a stand on it. And he insisted that the will was not any psychical or metaphysical agent. Rather, he said, the phenomena of volition must be explained by the physical forces of the organism alone. And he anticipated a lot of objection to that. As you might expect, he thought that retributive punishment was wrong. And he thought that we do horrendous things in dreams, shows how close any of us are to committing awful crimes. It's just a hair's breadth away, the sort of bugbear, but for the grace of God go I kind of thought. And he said, anyone who allows such experiences, dreams, murdering people, fantasies of murdering people, he perhaps had in mind, must entertain grave doubts as to the rightness of our method of exercising justice, which consists in making good one misery by a second. Spinoza said essentially the same thing. Well, folk philosophy distinguishes between things inside a person, their habits, their motivations, their desires, and forces acting on them from the outside, peer pressure and their cultural upbringing and things like that. But from the point of view of physics and chemistry, the inside-outside distinction is not relevant. To borrow an example of Harry Helson, I can smash a tea kettle to smithereens with my hammer, or I can fill it with hydrogen peroxide and set it on the stove and watch it blow up. In both cases, it's in smithereens, and internal, external didn't make a difference from the point of view of physics and chemistry. Bypassing science, some philosophers have tried to give us analytical definitions of agency, like saying that an agent involving event is an action just in case it is caused by the right agent involving mental states in the right way. And an example of that would be you want some milk, the milk is in the refrigerator, so you go to the refrigerator and open the door. And this is called the standard theory of agency. It's in the Stanford Encyclopedia, I think. But I think there are problems with this. It over-mentalizes things in the non-human world. I suppose a fruit fly has a reason to go for the fruit, but I don't think that the fruit fly's reason causes it to go to the fruit. And I think these mentalistic accounts give us sometimes too broad and sometimes too narrow an explanation of what agency is. So I want to try this another way. But Mach's declaration that the will is just a psychophysical phenomenon is really hard to understand. But fortunately, the science of atoms and molecules is not all that we have. We also have the life sciences, biological systems, and social systems. So that will be my approach in this talk. So first, motion and activity are everywhere in nature. Atoms, molecules too. These items are not seen as agents, even when they combine or repel each other, because there are no conditions that are good or bad for them, nothing they're trying to do, nothing is better or worse. But entities that replicate or reproduce do have things that are good or bad for them. They have evolved to occupy certain niches. Even a prion, you might think, it's trying to do something because it's a product of natural selection, and only prions that were able to, these misfolded proteins that can communicate their misfolding to other proteins, they're things that are good or bad for them. You can destroy a prion, you can't kill it, but you can destroy it. And a virus is an articulated object. It has different parts. The parts enable it, as we now know, to infect your nose, infect your lungs, infect different parts of you. So it is cued in, has adaptive qualities to do what it needs to do to survive and replicate. If this kind of infectious behavior of a prion just happened in a dish, we wouldn't really say that it was trying to do anything, or that anything was good or bad for it. It would just be like crystallization. But as we go up the scale of complexity, living things, we're less reluctant to say, less worried that we're just being anthropomorphic in saying that they are trying to do certain things, exercising agency. In the plant and animal realms, agency is more conspicuous. Even plants register some environmental conditions. They excrete toxins when they're under attack. They can communicate with other plants to let them know that there are problems. And they move their parts, even though they don't do this on an animal timescale. Sessile animals like sponges act in order to further their existence and reproduction. Even filter feeders that can't move pump water through their bodies to extract nourishment. So this talk of defending, attacking, immobilizing, killing, luring, consuming that we use in connection with biological entities doesn't apply to the neutralization of an acid by a base or another chemical process. But I don't think we're being anthropomorphic in applying it to the entities I just mentioned. Even if no humans existed, they would be trying to do those things. So there are some problem cases you can think of. What about an egg in the nest of a bird? Is that an agent? Well, from some perspectives, the egg is just a way of, the chicken is just an egg's way of making more eggs. As Samuel Butler is reputed to have said, it's bad for an egg to be too hot or too cold. And even eggs have certain homeostatic mechanisms to keep them going. But we don't see an egg as an organism with agency. It's not enough like us, and most importantly, it has no central nervous system. Very important, because agency principally applies to living individuals with limbs, a central nervous system, which move as a whole, animals. Here I'm borrowing Richard Dawkins' account of what it is to be an organism. It has a boundary, it has a skin, it has something to protect itself from the external world. It lets only certain things in, it lets other things out. And within that boundary, it has movable parts, legs, a head, eyelids. In the case of oysters, shells and gills that can move independently of the whole thing. The egg and the wing don't have limbs or central nervous system, so they're not principally agents. So non-human animals don't have the sort of language that allows for propositional thoughts, questions or commands, in which they figure as subjects, but they need to know quite a bit about what they are, what they're doing, what they did, and what they can do. We don't know exactly what it is to think in terms of I and me. For sure, the egg and the wing don't do so, but many animals, including birds and fish, understand that a mirror image is themselves, and animals that don't operate as visually seem to recognize their own sense songs. A mobile animal needs to know certain things about its own body. How big or small or wide am I? Can I fit through this space or will I get stuck? Which are my body parts that need to be protected or cleaned? When something hurts, where is it? What parts of my body can I move and which ones move by themselves? And what can I do? If I'm a squirrel, can I leap from this branch to that one? Or will I fall? Is it even worth a try? The animal also needs to know where it is in relation to other things, and where it is, in some cases, in absolute or relative space. As Lars Chitka points out, an animal needs to know when it, and not the external world, is the cause of some change. So, did I execute a cartwheel so I'm standing on my hands, or did the room revolve around me? Am I running or is the ground moving under my feet? From a visual point of view, it's the same, but my kinesthetic sensations tell me which is the case. Does it mean, or is it something outside of it? And obviously, information about how what it did enables the organism better to predict and control outcomes. Changes in the world that it did not initiate, but that are relevant to it, such as the appearance of prey or a predator, mandate action and are needed to maintain a reservoir of preparedness as to what can happen. Dreaming, which in our experience is usually associated with trying, is surprisingly widespread in the animal kingdom. Even insects experience some form of REM sleep. I don't know if they dream, but they have it. And dreaming, at least as far as we know, is first personal. In dreaming, I am faced with some situation that can be a bit peculiar or challenging, and I'm trying to figure out how to react to this new set of circumstances. The animal also needs to know about its extended self, what belongs to it and has to be protected, what is merely something else in the world, which ones are my mate, my offspring, my territory, my nest, my rival, my prey. And such possessions call for certain kinds of self-initiated action. So I need to know what is my action and what are my things. We know this is important because in some pathological cases, in some pathological human cases, this knowledge of what is mine is lacking or disturbed. In the animal world, the normal bird doesn't know that the cuckoo's egg is not its egg. And the human pathologies, visual field neglect, people don't know what's happening over there, or they can't recognize faces, even in people they know well, or they think they still have a limb, but it's been amputated, or in more abstract cases, they hoard old newspapers because these are parts of them that they cannot get rid of. Animals take decisions. Should I flee or fight? Continue to forage or save my strength? Birds decide with whom to mate, where to nest, and where to peck. The Dawkins, Richard and Marion, define behavior as a temporal sequence of muscular contractions, and the flow of behavior as a sequence of decisions, which change the probabilities of future actions. According to their conception, decisions need not be accompanied by reflective deliberation of the sort that happens when we imagine alternatives, or even consciousness. But now the radical objection to the very notion of agency seems to present itself. What if all these forms of self-knowledge and feelings of trying are just epiphenomena of a machine that is working by physical-chemical principles deterministically? Aren't we back in the Laplacian world of the 18th century and feels problematic? Well, borrowing from Antonio Damasio, you could say that consciousness is a feeling of knowing. Hunger is a feeling of knowing that your blood sugar is low. Pain is a feeling of injury or inflammation. Anger is a feeling of knowing that the world hurt you. And volition, you might say, is a feeling of knowing that you are the source of a change in your perceptions and sensations. The world did not change independently of you. But feelings of knowing are not knowing. What entitles me to claim that I did something, as opposed to simply that I felt as though I had done something, after my brain computed the inputs and outputs and did the thing that, according to my brain, was the best thing for me to do. The famous experiment of Benjamin Libet suggests that the feeling of intentionality, of deciding to move my finger, arises after the brain has already got ready for the action, even though it's experienced as after. And these temporal distortions, I think, were even noticed by Mach, so 100 or so years ago. He observes that the surgeon perceives a spurt of blood before the scalpel has made the incision. And I think one can perhaps explain this, that in perception, the brain correctly predicts what is going to happen sensorially. And in the volition case, it informs the subject what kind of movement, voluntary or involuntary, just took place some milliseconds ago, just started to take place. But some neuroscientists tell us that the self, the supposed agent, and the will are simply illusions generated by our brains. According to Daniel Wegner, in the aptly titled Illusion of Conscious Will is an indication that we think we have cause and action, not a revelation of the causal sequence by which the action is produced. So decisions, motives, and reasons have no causal power. Wegner says, reasons appear in our minds when we decide to interrogate ourselves, or someone else interrogates us as to why we did something. But we just strive to produce presentable reasons that fit with our self-image of being worthy and rational persons, or perhaps persons laboring under stress or misinformation. As Tom Nagel pointed out, if we had done B rather than A, we could have produced just as good reasons for doing B. So that volition is a feeling of knowing predicts that there are pathologies of volition. And Wegner cites some of these people think that the Ouija board's pointer is just spelling out a word by itself. They had nothing to do with it. In table lifting, people are not conscious of exerting effort to lift the table. It's believed that spirits are doing this instead. But in describing the will as an illusion, Wegner is not distinguishing clearly enough between agency as an essential illusion and these inessential or pathological illusions of agency. You might as well say, though, the visual world is an illusion. Yes, in a sense, it's just the presentation that my evolutionarily adapted brain is presenting to me as the one that's most effective for me getting around. But what we call veridical perception is one that enables us reliably to carry out our plans and to communicate with others. And a real volition, viable volition, as opposed to an illusory one, provides appropriate feedback as to what further courses of action are possible, what the results will be. So animals hunt and forage, pursue and evade, and birds and mammals seem to find agency even without behavioral rewards of an obvious sort rewarding. Bumblebees apparently like to play with rolling balls, as my co-author Lars Chitka found. You give them some little marbles to play with and enjoy pushing them around. Babies shake, rattles, and throw things. Monkeys prefer to press a lever that turns on a light rather than one that has no effect. And mice as well like to do things that have effects, whether they benefit them in an obvious way or not. There's an improvisational aspect to animal actions that I think is necessary to elucidate the idea of will, which I'm not defending. Think about how a child who's being chased by another in a game of tag follows a certain path, ducking and dodging while the pursuer tries to run ahead to cut her off. Pathway each player maps out involves a series of rapid and unconscious decisions. But is it determined? And could it be predicted in principle? The Laplacian idea that if we knew the position and motion of every atom in the universe, we could predict just what would happen. Or what about the pathway of the mosquito buzzing around my head that I am trying to swat, or the cockroach fleeing my shoe? The true Spinozist or Laplacian will maintain that even if you repeated the experiment, that pathway was necessary, could not have been different. If you repeated the experiment with the same initial conditions, the same pathways would be generated. Well, of course, we can't exactly repeat the experiment to test whether that's true. Not with real people because they're tired and they've had experience. So forth. I concede that point. But why not suppose that the game of tag could have resulted in two slightly different mappings from the ones we actually got? There's some evidence that animals, including invertebrates, behave much more variably and unpredictably in test situations than might have been expected. When will a horseshoe crab emerge from its hideout after a threat? Some are bold, some are shy, but the same animal will behave differently in the same context, approximate context at different times. As the researchers saying of uncertain origins goes, under controlled conditions of light, temperature, humidity, and nutrition, the organism will do as it damn well pleases. Variability is built into animal behavior, but why? Wouldn't it be better for the central nervous system to compute the best motor response based on memory and current sensory input? In that case, the same initial conditions must generate the same response. This essentially Cartesian conception of the animal machine as purely reactive dominated in physiological psychology for centuries. However, the nervous system seems inclined spontaneously to generate motor outputs to see what the sensory result might be. Animals must be constantly active, as Bren says, exploring, probing the environment with spontaneous actions, and planning the future accordingly. Today, he says, output-input as well as input-output computations are regarded as equally important mechanisms of action selection. Behavior that is routinely successful in serving the needs of the organism tends to become more predictable. A domestic animal learns to go to the same place at the same time to get fed, but a free living animal has less assurance about where food is to be found and where the dangers are. It benefits from exploratory as well as so-called exploitative behavior. And this exploratory behavior may be somewhat random. But how can a brain, a collection of particles acting according to the fundamental forces of nature, generate unpredictable behavior, generate even random behavior? Apparently, computers can only generate truly random numbers, not just pseudo-random numbers, according to an algorithm, by observing some outside data. The person writing this article says, like mouse movements or fan noise, or in other variations, static electricity from random lightning charges in the atmosphere, in order to generate a true sequence of random numbers. So seemingly paradoxically, the mouse brain has solved a problem, how to be random, that the fanciest computer can't solve without attending to nature, an animal or just the air or something like that. It's been suggested that brains are sufficiently complex to exploit nonlinearity. Brains may operate at criticality, meaning very, very slight differences in starting conditions, not just the comparatively large differences in my tag-gating thought experiment will lead to completely different outcomes. You might think of a voluntary action as something like the formation of a wave in the ocean. All sorts of factors that determine what this individual wave is going to look like at this instant, the winds, the moon, the other waves, all kinds of things. Also, nonlinear dispersive conditions, of which I know nothing, but the wave could be like other waves in its environment, or it could be a terrifying, rare monster wave of the sort that appears unpredictably when conditions are just right. Now, you might object that this is just to say that chance, a kind of unbiased dice rolling or coin flipping mechanism in the head, plays a role at the physiological micro level, and that everybody knows that chance is not free will. We've heard that for years and years. If I were to flip a coin whenever I had to choose between going out or staying in, or when faced with a decision like, should I go to medical school or should I go to law school, that would not be freedom. So why should internal coin flipping be any different from external coin flipping? Well, I think it is different. Internal coin flipping is accompanied by feelings of volition, the knowledge that it was I decided this and am doing this, by my ability to provide reasons for what I decided, and by the fact that I can regret or congratulate myself for having made the right or the wrong choice. And here the distinction between disappointment and regret, between being pleased at some outcome the world delivered to me and feeling satisfied at having thought about some outcome, emerges as important. Suppose I'm forced to make decisions by flipping an external coin. As a result, I go to law school instead of medical school. If I have a bad experience in law school, I will be disappointed and frustrated that now I'm stuck there. But there's nothing for me to regret, because my only way of deciding things, except was to flip coins. But suppose I have to flip coins internally, and I go to law school and don't like it, I regret it. I was the one that made that decision. And it could have turned out otherwise, according to me. So this, I think, adds a further dimension to basic animal agency. It's not present in oysters. I don't think they regret things, probably not in mosquitoes. But feelings of regret, as opposed to disappointment, seem to be shared with some non-human animals. This was indicated by the rat restaurant experiment, in which a device was set up where rats could run around a kind of circular tube, and there were various food offerings placed at different points from their starting point. Rats have different preferences, some like cheese, some like chocolate, very individual that way. And it was found that when they if they bypassed offerings of the less favored food, they could hold out for the more favored food that was later on. But rats, which did not wait long enough and discovered that the better food was over here, and now flocked to them because they'd already gone to the earlier one, experienced regret, not just disappointment. They seemed to be able to envision alternative possibilities, directions that they did not take. So to conclude this section, we, in common with other animals, have feelings, mostly veridical, that we've initiated or chosen some action. We have an awareness that our and other people's behavior is somewhat unpredictable. We don't know in advance what we and others are going to do. And we can imagine what we could have done but did not, what was within our power as an organism, and what the consequences would likely have been. So under conditions for free will, I have them listed on the handout. The organism must have mostly true beliefs about what it can and can't do and might be able to do. It must have feelings of agency and ownership about which actions were its and what it might be able itself to bring about in the future. It needs to make decisions. Its decisions must be somewhat variable and unpredictable, opaque even to itself. And it must be able to feel disappointment about how things turned out and or regret about what it chose to do. One might feel that more is required, but what could this more be? A world-aware, better advised homunculus that was me, and that could stop or start things that my brain was about to set in motion or not set in motion. I don't think this makes any sense, this thing that is me and yet not my brain. I just am my brain and body. Oh, these conditions are mostly satisfied. That's jumping the gun a bit. These conditions are mostly satisfied by most humans from a young age, and not by other animals. But human life too is an exercise of mapping out a pathway. George Lakoff wrote this whole book about metaphors we live by, and life as a journey was one of the main metaphors, of course. In retrospect, I may interpret what at the time felt like a deliberate choice, and was, according to my criteria, as something inevitable and fated, but that simply testifies to a human liking for explanatory causal narratives. So now I jump in the last few minutes of this talk to the anthropological, sociological level layered on top of this account of agency. The moral legal problem of determinism is not dispensed with, even if we now have some conception of free will. How can we justly punish people when their brains, functioning in an as non-linear, improvisatory, unpredictable fashion as you like, generate the personalities that we deem immoral, the actions we deem illegal? And there's a movement that I think is well represented by P.F. Strawson in his famous article, Freedom and Resentment, in which he claimed that we have these social practices to which the theoretical truth of determinism could make no difference. There's just no impact that it can have on these settled forms of life. I think there's a sort of Wittgensteinian idea behind it there. And this quietist position doesn't get a whole lot of defense in Strawson. It's just very provocative, but I think it could be developed as follows, even though I'm not going to endorse it completely. Many non-human animals have social relationships that involve evaluation. They like and dislike other members of their species. They remember who helped and harmed them. And there's a form of proto-morality that's been documented in other primates. But in the absence of language, material culture, and very complex forms of interdependency, other animals just don't engage in the same range of evaluative situations that we do. And humans, as opposed to other animals, including other primate cousins of ours, seem to be pretty good at the following: inhibiting impulses, disguising or repressing emotions for the sake of keeping the peace or not embarrassing themselves or others, seeing themselves and their actions as others see them, blaming themselves, correcting bad habits, evaluating and revising their life goals. These are developed through social learning, which begins in early childhood and is reinforced by many external sources attempting to make us more socially tolerable persons. Few of us become perfect in all these dimensions, but the fact that we try and others try to make us so explains all our practices of fearing, avoiding, trusting, admiring, scorning, and so forth. And with them come all our tough examining practices, prize giving, moral and legal liability, retaliation, revenge, and punishment. Moral rules, it's been observed, tend to be prohibitory. Don't do that, quit that, even when they're phrased positively. Be generous, don't be stingy. And this has to do with what might be called Machiavellian intelligence, people's ability to exploit others for their own benefit when they sense a weakness or an opportunity. Moral rules say, don't do that, don't take advantage. And moral rules, you might say, are meant to prevent people exercising too much free will. Sometimes they should be exercising more free will, doing something. There are also crimes and defects of omission, as well as things you do. But on the whole, morality is kind of negative. Now, Adam Smith, I think, was the person who explored most fully the formation of the moral personality. Others sympathize with me, not in the sense that they feel sorry for me or understand everything I do, but they see what situation I'm in and they assess, am I reacting properly to it, which is usually less than the way he thinks, at least at the beginning, before I'm socialized, I think is fine for me to react. So we learn to moderate our tantrums and control our grimaces, since others find them frightening and embarrassing. The legal theorist Meyer Dan Cohen points to another distinctive feature of human life, the powers of what he calls self-constitution. I think of myself as a certain sort of person, like being punctual. So I try very hard to live up to this image I have of myself, showing up on time, or an honest taxpayer. And these assumptions and refusals are, of course, influenced by social judgment. And what he calls, Dan Cohen again, the articulations of a shared public conception of the self. And in some cases, the self can be quite extended. So I might assume responsibility for the bad behavior of my children, or the fact that my car breaks down when I'm trying to take you somewhere. It's not my fault, but I sort of feel bad because the car is an extension of me. And the informal sanctions described by Smith, withdrawal of trust and cooperation, disapproval and gossip, these all have a regulative role, and most of the time they're not too bad, but punishment meted out historically by the law courts or other authorities has often seemed to be more than the situation really requires. You think of all the things humans have done to other humans in the name of justice and correct behavior: stoning, torture, solitary confinement, hanging, guillotining, shooting, poisoning, just to maintain decorum and law and morality. Smith thought that given human error, only religion, faith, and postmortem justice could afford solace to the man unjustly accused. People are also, as I mentioned, blamed and held responsible for failing to exercise agency. This area of legal theory has achieved prominence now in connection with changed standards, for example, labor conditions. Shouldn't those people have realized there was something wrong with slavery long before they did? Gender relations, how could people have carried on the way they did in the 1950s? Shouldn't they have known? Animal welfare, and so forth. Well, in light of the preceding discussion, I think the philosophical justification for having the institution of punishment, something appeared there that.
Try to push the mouse.
Oh, okay. Okay. That one. So I think this is these sorts of things are the best justification one can give for quietism if one's trying to flesh that out. And if I were to formalize this, I'd say the philosophical justification for having the institution of punishment at all depends on our confidence in four conditions. We can assign the ownership of harmful actions and omissions. We have a grasp of what actions are possible for human beings, what temptations can they resist, and what sorts of happenings can come to their notice in the case of omissions. We have to be confident that human beings have the ability to evaluate the moral significance of alternative courses of action and to value virtuous restraint or intervention. And we should be certain that human behavior is modifiable by learning, including experiencing disapproval and punishment, or simply witnessing it. So, in defense of quietism, I would agree that to dismantle our practices of punishment across the board, we'd have to show that we can't do those things. We would need a whole new anthropology based in the observation of our fellows, not in our views about atoms and molecules, if the determinist objection to punishment were to hold. So that's the best elaboration I can give of the quietist position. But there is a problem. The conditions for assigning responsibility and punishing generically that I just listed are often not met by real individuals. In fact, you have to wonder, in the case of criminality, condition 3, we must be confident that human beings have the ability to evaluate the moral significance and to value actions and to value virtuous restraint or intervention. If our criminal had that, then how come he committed the crime? So we seem to have a conflict here. The generic conditions that support the institution of punishment in general are often not met by the individual criminal So retributive punishment at least lacks a foundation. And exactly as the determinist maintains, though not exactly for determinist reasons. But getting back to determinism, if we now say, all right, we will move to a deterrence theory of punishment, or a reform theory of punishment, whether certain punishments work generically is an empirical question. The criminologists have done research into this, and they've, of course, decided that certain kinds of punishment do work to deter or to get the criminal to behave better in the future. But this is always statistical. In 70% of cases, it worked pretty well to prevent recidivism. And even in this case, the beliefs of the people who vote and to make policy are often starkly at odds with the judgments of experts. According to the judgments of experts, long prison sentences are very bad. People adapt to institutional life. They make new friends in the underworld and learn all sorts of new techniques. Thanks. Yeah. Random movements generating unfocused effects. And whether a given punishment will work for a given individual, the single case is not an empirical question. We don't know till we put them in jail and saw what it did. We can estimate probabilities for people like that and maybe find out later. So a person is considered responsible for infractions that a human being in the culture assessing him or her is supposed to have been able to learn or figure out. But we know that people in general, can and can't do certain things. They can't control their heartbeats, etc. We suppose they can control their impulses to lie, cheat, steal, kill, and rape, even when there are incentives and opportunities to do so, because we've seen cases where other people have managed to do that. But we can't rely on this sort of statistical knowledge in the individual case. And we even know that people who are witnesses to violence in childhood and have all these other environmental problems, who can't envision other alternatives, are going to find it much harder to control their impulses and to form more socially acceptable plans. Even if they can represent to themselves alternative possibilities, and even if they regret, in the case of the drug addict, their action, these better alternatives may not lie within their power in the situation any more than it lies within the squirrel's power to leap to that other branch. Just can't do it. An addict may feel disappointment when he takes the next hit, or he may feel regret that he did not resist when he could have. Maybe he could have. He doesn't know. There's no way to tell which feeling may be more appropriate. Before a person attempts to jump over a stream, and this person may have no idea whether they are able to do it or not. If they fail after attempting, perhaps they still could have done it. So, good. So to conclude, we have free will, I think, because we, like other animals, have a robust, evolutionarily imprinted consciousness of self-initiated actions, and we know behavior is unpredictable, and all the other reasons I mentioned. The background moral capabilities of human beings, self-control, respect for morality, generic knowledge serve as rational justifications for blame and punishment. But there's still this question of fairness and philosophical justice to the individual. We have, in short, the ideal of a peaceful society that works by the only means it can to discourage criminality, certain kinds of punishment or intervention. And we have the ideal of justice to individuals and the avoidance of futility. punishing people when it will do no good, or trying other methods that will still do no good. These are in conflict, and as is often the case with social problems, we probably can't figure out a total solution, but work incrementally to mitigate the most obvious evils in the current systems of prison and punishment. So that is end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this talk.
Should I be?
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Wilson, for your talk. It was very interesting. I gathered from one point in your lecture that you are rejecting the possibility of libertarian free will on the basis of it implying a certain regression. I think that you've coined it a homunculus, making the choice within the consciousness of the organism. Is that why you consider a libertarian free will approach unsuitable for supposedly generating the apparent randomness that you described?
Sorry, just say that last part again.
I'm asking for the reason for your presumed objection to libertarian free will.
Yes, is that the homunculus is incoherent, whereas just some little thing in my brain that is pushing me one way or the other is not incoherent, even though it's not as deterministic as we think the rest of the brain is going to be.
So they are not the same. They are not the same thing.
It's not a homunculus, because the homunculus, I think when we say, I think this experience comes from wishing I hadn't done that, wishing that something had stopped me from just being pushed, as I think of it, by my brain to, let's say, take the drug. But that's wishing that I had been able, in the same sense that I wish I had been able to jump over that obstacle. I couldn't, but there couldn't have been a homunculus that made me able to jump over the obstacle, or a homunculus that made me able to resist the drug.
But isn't it just a problematic way of saying I chose badly at that juncture?
Yeah.
So
the homunculus just as another
the
device.
experience of making a bad decision that does not necessarily imply a homunculus. It simply returns to the agent itself, its consciousness.
Yeah. Yes.
Its awareness of its being able to choose.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Ona?
Thank you for the talk. My question in terms of the role of biology in morality. What I expected before in the talk is an appeal to biology in order to find some non-cognitive modes of agency. But you do something else. You actually construe biological processes and features in a cognitive way in order to understand human beings who are unquestionably cognitive agents. So why do you take this road? Why can't you do it without biology and just focus on human beings?
I think that without going this route through the life sciences, we're really stuck back in this dilemma. Everything is just atoms and molecules and laws of nature on one hand, and then human mentality on the other, which people have tried to approach from this analytical standpoint. And of course, there's this vast literature with all the variations of hard determinism, soft determinism, compatibilisms of 15 sorts, and this causal theory of agency, reasons as causes. And I don't think any of that is as clarifying as going just back to what is action in the natural world and how is human action something more complex than animal action, and yet sharing certain common elements with it. So maybe it's just my subjective feeling of I feel I understand free will and can defend free will better without going down the analytical metaphysical route.
But the price is understanding animals in a very anthropomorphic way. And I don't know, I'm not a student of biology and I'm not a biologist, but I tend to think that most biologists wouldn't like this approach.
And I think sentiments have changed somewhat in the last 20, 25 years, and most recently. My co-author Lars Chitka and I wrote a paper on insect consciousness. So I have to be upfront here. Lars is very convinced that insects have experiences. I used to poo-poo this notion as absolutely ridiculous, but I've kind of come around to the view that if we evolve consciousness, it must be somehow useful for doing all the things we do. And if it's useful for us, why wouldn't it be useful for other animals that have to face all these problems in the world, in an unpredictable world, of how to get around? So, no, change my view there. I suggested that, yes, there's definite anthropomorphic projection when we talk about a prion attacking the bodies and setting to work misfolding proteins in our brains, in case we have Creutzfeldt-Jakob. But I think the anthropomorphic projection diminishes as we go through the taxa.
Mail.
I've a few remarks. Difficult for me to ask questions. Remarks. When always when we talk about free will, I have this saying of Thomas Mann: there is no free will, there is freedom and there is will. When you try to combine them, it's going to none. And I think this is also what life itself, because once I will, I not free. Because I want something, then this wish does not makes me not free to be a rational creature like God. God is the most unfree because he knows what to do. He does not need to wish or to will, except for one wish to create this world. I don't know how like this thing. Why he decided this, but I think it's correct. And another thing that another expression that I think it's problematic, it's true belief. I think there is a belief and knowledge. Belief is no concern to truth. There is no true belief. And I think this is what Nietzsche said, that the most important lie of evolution is our belief in truth. And also it's our belief, I think, in free will. But why evolution? And I think this is different from the animals because we have language. We can think, okay, I'm responsible to this or not responsible, to be or not to be. And once we ask this, if we don't have the responsibility, then we can come to some excuses like Eichmann in the Nazi, it does not have responsibility because you don't have a freedom or something like this. But animals, you said we are behavior like animals. I don't think we are. Language makes it totally different. And this is why evolution needed, I think like evolution needed this because we can think about it. We need to do it, not need to do it, blah, 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 to be on. The last thing I want to say about the dream, there is a theory that dream is a wish. One important say, and it's important because in the dreams, it's not we are close to murder, we wish to murder. We have this instinct, I hate this guy, I want to kill him. And what Kant says in his ethics, that person can overcome this wish. And this is, he says, even if someone killed, and he says, I think this is his example, he was raised in a bad environment, etc. We still give him some responsibility. We play with this, but we don't free him from the murder because he's a human being, he has responsibility, he has language he can talk about, he can understand. It's not like an animal. This is
Okay, that's a lot of questions, but I try to go back to the beginning about God's freedom just in having there being only one thing God can do, namely the best thing. And I think Descartes says something kind of similar about when my mind is just compelled to see the truth of this proof, that's a kind of freedom. And I think what they're trying to get away from is the idea that free will is just making arbitrary decisions. That's the reason for this, for what I think of as an overstatement. I think your point about the difference that language makes is quite right. It's very hard when I'm sort of suggesting that animals have true beliefs, they have knowledge about their bodies and what's where and what belongs to them. How this could be represented in a non-linguistic animal that doesn't think in sentences as we do, I have no insight into that. That's a good question. And is there something like mental ease that is, however, non-linguistic, non-propositional? I don't know. They're quite, you suggested that dreaming is kind of wish fulfillment. This is an old Freudian idea, isn't it? It's not really mostly my experience of dreaming. Maybe other people are quite different. But my experience of dreaming is normally there's something I'm trying to get done or figure out what's going on. I try different things and they don't quite work in a situation that's rather confusing. There's a good Japanese novel about this, The Unconsoled, where a man has to go to a strange town to play a concert and the buses don't seem to go to the right place and there's no door to the auditorium and all these problems keep arising. So wish fulfilling dreams, I find I have very, very seldom. 2 examples, but maybe other people's experience is different. One theory of dreaming is that the brain needs to present us with absurd situations so as to prepare us to encounter novel, unexpected, problematic things that fall out of our routine experience. It seems as good an explanation as any.
Oriane?
Hi. So thank you. It was very interesting. I would like to go back to what you said about how about the difference between regret and disappointment, and that maybe mice regret their decisions.
Or rats.
Rats.
Mice do
not
not.
mice. Yeah, no, I thought it was different. Anyway, so I wanted to ask, I have a couple of questions around this. First of all, how can we know in non-human animals if they are regretting or disappointing? But also, how important do you think this distinction is for agency? And then if some animals don't have this, do you still think they are agents in some way? Maybe they have consciousness already. And then would that imply that agency is kind of a continuum? Or is consciousness, are they the same agency and consciousness? Or maybe first there is consciousness, then there is agency? And if so, then what would you say is like the, I don't know, the movement from like
Yeah. But so that's a good question. How do they know that the rat has a different experience of regret versus disappointment? And I believe this has to do with just different areas of the brain lighting up, as they say, that correspond also to humans' experiences of regret versus disappointment. But it's not approved because we can't interview them. So quite right. And yes, I think this regret thing may be scalar. It is obviously scalar because mosquitoes don't have it. The rats apparently do. I don't know about cats, for instance. If we tried that distinction in cats, nobody has tested them, especially for that. Dogs, probably yes. Probably yes. But horses and cows, again, I don't know. But yeah, so it'd be an interesting question. What are the social relations or other relations of animals such that they do or don't have have that different experience.
And do you think this is very central to agency, or this is just an example?
It is very central to our agency.
Okay.
Snake.
Thank you for your talk. And I actually wanted to, in some way, my question is connected to all that, but there are 2 points that I wanted to ask first. One is the role of imagination, because when you talk about choice, it means that you can think about possible options, otherwise there's no choice. And so imagination comes in, because you have to imagine possible options in order to decide. So if you attribute it to animals, then you have to really discuss the issue of that Orion mentioned, whether consciousness is scalar, whether there is a spectrum of element of consciousness which is related to imagination if possible option. Otherwise, I don't see how you can talk about choice or non-random or non-stochastic behavior or intentional and so on and so forth. So that's one question that I wanted to ask. The other one is about what you call moral behavioral responsibility and so on and so forth. And I would call it social norms. So you start from the individual and you talk about the individual adopting or not adopting proper behavior and so on and so forth. I would start from the collectivity, for the individual, and also it's the same case for animals, because we do know that in animal societies there are punishments. And it means that there is some kind of a beginning of such norms of one kind or another. So also in moral responsibility, the issue is social norms. You start from the collectivity, and then you ask how individuals within that collectivity perceive the norms, the ought, and the is, and so on and so forth within these norms. If you start from the individual, I don't see how you can get to the others.
Okay, so first on the imagination. Yeah, again, kind of interesting question, because looking at kind of down the taxa, you see these things happening that seem to be involving choice in the animal kingdom. Like you see butterflies, and they seem to be deciding whether to mate or not, and then they fly off in opposite directions usually. Decision was made, I think. Butterfly decided, not that one. I don't think it has a picture in its mind of the ideal butterfly mate. With the rats, I don't know if they have some image of the better food that was waiting for them down there if they hadn't gone for this one. We certainly do. In many, many cases, we imagine law school will be like this, or my best example is imagining what my restaurant meal is going to look like. Just reading the menu, and it never actually looks like what I imagine. Many people have a lot of visuality and use a lot of visuality in making decisions, but they don't have to.
So in that case, I go back to what Owen asked, so why do you need biology? If free will is a basic experience in the animal world, then it has to fulfill certain conditions of being such a basic experience. If it is scalar, then you can say that for butterflies, they don't have a representation of representation, but maybe apes do have representation of humans. So then, instead of talking about free will in general, you have to talk about sort of a core of experience, of experiencing agency that higher up in the evolutionary scale will become free will. Otherwise, I don't quite see what you gain, as Mona said. I don't see what you gain by starting with animals.
Yeah. Well, you take we go back to the criminal case. The criminal shoots up the gas station. I don't think they have to have a visual image. They have to know I don't have to shoot up this gas station in order to be agents. Actually, it was possible not always to shoot up gas stations when you encounter them. But they don't have to have a kind of a visual image of what that alternative would be like if they didn't do it. They don't have to have a visual image really of what it will be like if they do it. They can be making a very non-pictorial kind of decision. They just have to know, I needn't have done that. And people tend to know that.
And they mention all the name.
Yeah, but I certainly don't think that all across the animal realm, every individual satisfies these conditions for free will. They're just sort of building blocks of free will that in our case are very elaborately exemplified.
Only?
And what about social norms?
Sorry, what about
Social norms.
Oh, yes, yeah. I think that's the virtue of Smith's approach. He sees the individual as just surrounded by this community of people, trying to get that person to be someone who will behave and react properly.
It's
All
still
of them.
aggregate. Yeah, it's still an aggregate. Sweet, it's an aggregate society.
Yeah.
Not a collective.
Ollie? There's a certain aura of naturalism about your talk.
Yes.
You look at nature and you try to describe nature, and all these judgments that involve agency pop up whenever we talk about animals, all kinds of whether very simple or complex animals. And because that talk of agency is very useful, that's what I take the argument to be in describing animals. We don't need analytic metaphysics to tell us what agency is. We can use that. We can take from our descriptions of nature what we need to substantiate these claims of agency and free will.
Yep.
But then you said, in your comments, you said, well, clearly sometimes when we use that language, it's an anthropomorphic projection. Sometimes it isn't. You know, if we talk about prions, it probably is just a projection. And if we talk about maybe things, then maybe it's more appropriate. It's not a projection. So how do you differentiate between those cases that are just anthropomorphic projection and those cases that are not a projection? I think you need some vision of what nature is like to make the difference. It's not enough to go the naturalistic route. So how do you cite that all of these metaphysical discussions about laws of nature, that's how we describe nature, that nature is governed by laws, and then if nature is governed by laws, then maybe we don't have free will. How do you sidestep that, given that you yourself admitted that sometimes we project and sometimes we don't?
So we think this kind of scalar approach won't work. We need an analytic cutoff there.
But I think you said that, right? I mean, you said that sometimes we anthropomorphically project and sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
So it seems like your argument needs to tell us when we do and when we don't.
When we don't. Well, I do think it's gradual. Nothing in nature makes leaps. Only in philosophy we like to cut things off. So the things that it's anthropomorphic to describe that way, even though people do. In the medical journals, this talk of the prion attacking and all of that. Is when it becomes an organism, when it has movable limbs, when it has more complexity of behavior. When it becomes more like us, so the egg and the wing don't have this, even though they are, from the point of view of atoms, molecules, and genes, right? No different than the bird. The bird has agency, the egg doesn't.
So there's no way for me to know philosophically exactly what you mean by
No, but if I,
nature.
yeah, but if I tell you that the candidate here has movable limbs, it forages, it looks for things, it has to choose mates, it can eat a variety of foods, then the chances are good. That one is an agent. And if I tell you it sticks a prong into cells and injects its RNA, yeah, still maybe an agent, but not so much of one. If I say that's all it does.
So,
Thank you very much. So I'm interested more in social agents, corporate agency, and how two agents combine together into configuration. First of all, I'm wondering if you think that the conditions that you presented are applicable to social agents.
Sorry, if what was
The
invented?
conditions that you presented are applicable to social agents as well. And also, because your motivation appears to be connected to legal responsibility, just punishment and stuff like that, it appears that something like a social agent is required for that discussion. This is something that we have to take into consideration. If you want to discuss it, justice or just punishment.
You mean an individual existing outside of a society would not have agency or would not have responsibility?
Seems to me that punishment requires some aspect of it. Punishment isn't something arbitrarily decided just by someone, especially if we discuss something like just punishment. There seems to be some sort of consensus there that it is inflicted with the agreement of other people within this.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the collective understanding is that people must be discouraged from doing things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was a book by David Graeber or an article that alerted me to thinking about morality as basically a set of prohibitions. All the thou shalt nots, all the what he calls the no-nos addressed to the folk.
השבל של האחרונה.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting and clear presentation. I have one point that remained a bit vague. The distinction between pure chance and unpredictability. It didn't stand alone, but as we know, also with nature, quantum physics, we also have unpredictability, which I guess we would name a pure chance and not the free will of the electrons. So I was wondering if you have a clear distinction
Between chance and unpredictability.
Yeah.
Well, unpredictability is the outcome of chance, right? The phenomenological thing that results from the chance. But you're right. This is, I think, the most really intriguing part, and the part I understand the least, right? Of this case I want to put together. It would help if I understood more about nonlinear dispersive conditions and things like that, which I don't. But I suspect that this is really quite important, this variability and unpredictability of behavior, which we also observe. I think we often have very little idea of what a person is going to do or what an animal is going to do. Even from our close observation, we can't always tell. And this observation that how did I want to put it? Yes, that there may be mechanisms which purposely generate random exploratory behavior in an animal which are functional. I think this is a very interesting discovery. There was a picture that I was trying to find my way back to when I was doing the research of the path that a rat takes in its cage when it's looking for food. And you map this out, it's just all over the place, a very, very dense pattern of lines. And this sort of took me to this idea that if you ran an experiment again of one person fleeing and one person chasing in a complex environment, would it really be the same? Must we believe that it would be exactly the same? And I don't see why we must believe that it would be.
That's connect us again to the question whether this chance or randomness as much is connected to free will, and how much is the question of the unpredictability, whether the unpredictability is our limits of our abilities, like with the non-linear equations, which are in principle are totally deterministic, or the linear equations of quantum mechanics, which are in principle, the equations are, but the rules, but the laws are not predictable. So that's I think these are two different things, but I think we won't solve them now.
Yeah. The important thing is even if the decision was made kind of by chance in your brain, could have gone the other way, just went that way. You do the thing, and the reasons why you did it jump into your mind, because Wegener is right. We can fabulate these reasons, that's ways that make sense. Is that enough for free will? Well, I think so, because now this is part of my identity. I felt like I was doing it. I decided it. I'm the sort of person that decides to go to law school, not to medical school. What more do we want? The homunculus that can stop and start things, but we can't have that.
So with this abstract and very, we can finish now, and thank you again for Professor Wilson for this interesting talk, and for all the participants, and everyone is invited to join us in the Hugatzfoni for first drink on the institute, but you are all welcome. Thank you.
זה לא אבל זה משמעותי בדיוק. הייתי צריך לעשות יש יום אחד very nice and very surprising. That would be a sense of safety. I am choosing. And that's in my mind. The revolutionary. Sorry.
And you're
I'm a student. My life is in reverse. I have background in neuro. I work in bionic systems. So I interface a lot with the medicine.